Good afternoon, everyone. We start our today's discussion, and we thank the journalists and activists who are interested in the topic of torture. This topic should be studied, and we thank our guests who joined us in order to explain what is going on in Ukraine and in what way tortures are prevented and why it is important to speak about it. On the 26th of June, there is a day of victims of torture, and today's discussion will be started with Artem Chupai. He is a journalist, and in June, he encountered with torture. Can you tell us your story? Good afternoon. I'm Artem Chupai. I worked in the Ukrainian News Information Agency for about 10 years. I was preparing the materials, and it was in June 2014 in the Izum region, Kharkivska Oblast, Dovhenka village, and there was a staff of ATO, the center of ATO operation, and I worked and at about 3 or 4 p.m. I was detained by soldiers that were on leave, and they decided that I am suspicious. So, of course, I didn't have any objections. I thought that everything was okay. I believed that they will verify the documents and release me, and I didn't know about other cases of mistreatment of journalists and civilians. This was on the 3rd of June. This was my second trip in the ATO area, and I thought that everything will be okay, but they beat me a lot. When they hit me for the first time, I was shocked. I couldn't understand what was going on, and they was beating me for several hours. So I was shocked, and they asked me who recruited me and for whom I worked. So they did not use some medieval tortures, no electric shock, but they beat me to the condition that I was completely exhausted. And for me, psychological torture was the hardest. So they threatened me with some medieval tortures. So my colleague was detained in Crimea, so the opposite side, and we spoke in the night, and the methods were identical. That's why we can make a conclusion that this is not the invention of some officers, but maybe in Soviet times there were some methods for special services. So they said that they will cut my ears, and I heard about it many times. Also, they threatened that they will cut out my nipples, and also they threatened me with shooting. They shot above my ears from behind, so I didn't know whether they will hit me. And also they say that they will shoot in the hip, and also they said that they will execute me, or that I will be given to landing troops if you do not confess we will give you two landing troops. They open the mouth, and then they put a barrel of a gun, and then they say that you should confess that you work for Putin, for example. And I said that I obtained a grant as an interpreter. They started to interrogate me, and they asked whether I worked for CIA. And when they detained me, I believed that everything will be okay with me, and there were no registration cards at the time. So SBU just got the documents by mail, and I was sure that everything will be okay with me because, firstly, I had registration in the west of Ukraine, and I believe that I am deprived of all these accusations. I am a journalist, I am a civilian, and I was pro-Ukrainian. And when I left, there was one more person. When I stayed there, I was afraid to ask about this person because I was, and I didn't tell anything to this person, but he helped me a lot. He was there for 3 days. For him, the hardest was that we were in the car. Our eyes were closed. I was handcuffed, and at night, the handcuffs behind your back, they really uncomfortable, and I decided that I should just put my hands in the front because that really hurt. And that person that was for 3 days there, he said that for him it was hard to be in this position. At night it was really cold and I couldn't sleep because I was afraid and because of cold. And he was there for 3 days already. In my case, it turned out that I was verified. And why didn't they do it before beating? I cannot understand this. Also, I had an impression because my wife started to call. She called to press secretary of ATO, Dmitry Shkivsky, and he said that he was forced to lie in the media. So I didn't mention this in my reporting. Mitrishkivsky said that he knew that I was detained, and he said to my wife that everything was okay. They knew who I was, but they continued to beat me. And this is not some military necessity. So I was released the next morning. They knew who I was, that I am not working for separatists. There was a dossier on me. It is really easy to verify. And when I was released, I didn't know whether I should write about it. I was supported by the chief aide of Tatiana Nikolaenko, and she said that I should write about it, and other journalists also believed that we should highlight this information in the media. And my reporting was released, and you can find it on the internet. It is called How I Was a Terrorist, and some people, I was afraid that they will blame me that I work for Putin, but I partly say that these actions of these people, I was afraid that they knew my address. I provided them with information about my address, and there was some sort of Stockholm syndrome, because during beatings, when they stop, you feel some sort of love to these people, and the longer the harder it was. And then when I was released, I started to, it turned out when at the same day, Arkady Babchenko was detained. He was the resident of Russia. He had pro-Ukrainian position, but he was detained by counterintelligence service. And he was beaten, and he posted the photos of these beatings, and my report was released. And after this, Sergei Sherbina, insider director, also it was before Galatei, and there were no results, and I was invited in a month after these events happened, and maybe there was an order not to mutilate me, and I had some bruises on my body. Also, I was invited in a month, and they said you need to undergo medical examination. I asked, please invite me to medical military institution, but they say no, you should do it on your own expense. They invited me several times, and based on some remarks to colonels who were involved in this case, they knew who detained me, and the person said, work soldiers, and they understood who it was right away. And it ended. They just tried to. There were some representatives of the military, defense ministry, and ADO officers, and also law enforcers. So they just point their fingers at each other. They didn't want to take responsibility, and the case is going on. And in some reports, this case was mentioned. I was interviewed by organizations of Helsinki Group, but there is no official result. If you have some questions, I will be glad to answer. So you can put your questions right after. If you have questions, please. Artyom, I have several questions to you. Till 3rd of June 2014, what was your attitude towards torture? How did you imagine this? I had abstract idea of what it was. Then I understood that this happens constantly. But usually it is done by law enforcers with people who has no votes. So they detain some alcoholic, some people without housing, and they did it. So that was the only information I had. And now this topic is in the spotlight. People started to speak about it, and it can happen to anyone. So I was released, but the person that stayed there with me, I don't know why he was detained, but maybe he's still there. So I have a status that can be clearly verified. I'm the member of journalist union and everything. I was writing before you can verify this, but 2 people were detained. They are farmers, and they just went along the way, and there were checkpoint, and they were detained, and they shot at their knees. And how can they prove that they are not supporters or gunners? So by default, they believe that if they are locals, they support separatism. And how can they prove that this is wrong, that you are not camels? So it was really difficult. So is it principle for you that your case is investigated properly, and that those persons who are guilty are brought to responsibility, those who beated you and those who were the reason of such violations? Honestly, if someone would investigate this case, but I'm not ready to go into courts and spend a lot of time for this, because I have no moral support. I believe that these people won't be punished. They won't go into prison. Do you have questions? So I would like to give the floor to Mykola Gnatowski. He is head of European Committee on Prevention of Torture. Do you have some comments about the story of Artyom that you heard? Thank you. The story is sad, but it shows. And Artyom, I greet him with this bravery that he made this reporting, but the story shows that in times when order is ruined, and there is crisis and armed conflict. So the remains of civilization disappear, and problems arise that are in society that are connected with lack of culture in law enforcers among the military. And many countries of Europe suffered from it, our neighbors, and now we suffer of this. And now it demonstrates the necessity of creating a system that will allow effectively investigate such cases in order to bring to responsibility those who committed these crimes, and even more important, to prevent them in future. So the committee had that each state can provide information about these violations, and most countries decided to report and publish these documents. We know that Ukraine is among these states. Can we compare the situation in Ukraine concerning torture and also with the situation in Europe? I explain how it works. Maybe my colleagues and journalists do not know a lot about the committee and its work. Ukraine, together with 46 other states of European continent, is the members of the Council of Europe, and they are the participant of European Convention on Human Rights, and it defines, or it should define, the attitude towards human rights that do not only correspond to world approach, but also to European one. That is the most prominent. So the prohibition of torture or abuse of people, inhuman treatment, or the degrading human dignity, this is the main part of the system in order to defend a person and its dignity. And in 1980s, people understood, and the system was only among Western European democracies, that it's not enough just to react in courts or among law enforcers or in administration or in detention facilities, in the actions that humiliate human dignity or torture, that we need a system not only of reaction, but also the system of prevention. And according to European Convention on Torture, there was a committee created that now are supported by 47 countries of the Council of Europe, and it has the right of access to any detention facilities in these 47 states. And conclusions of this committee, they prepare some reports, and these are confidential reports to the government. Sovereign states do not provide easy access to some secret facilities, and there is sharing. So we provide full access, and you provide confidential reports in order to react on these problems and remove them. Not just react, but to prevent. But the European Court deals with this issue about the access and openness. The majority of the Council of Europe state, they remove this confidentiality not automatically, but on the whole it happens so. When this report is provided, the state has the time to publish, and this information can be known, and the European Court uses these reports as evidence when they consider individual cases. So in case of Artyom, if he would complain, if he would go to the court, and if there is no result, there is opportunity to complain to European Court on Human Rights, and this court also would review these reports and would identify the main parameters of the situation about the system of interrogation and reporting and where to complain. And Ukraine, before the war, it happened, so on the eve, it happened before the conflict in the east of Ukraine. Ukraine confirmed that these reports are automatically published, and Ukraine went so far that was ready to publish even intermediary documents, not only final reports, but preliminary recommendations and observations of the committee. And it placed Ukraine among those states that showed complete openness. These are 5 states: Moldova, Ukraine, then Bulgaria, Luxembourg, and Sweden. Other states, they firstly think, they provide answer, and then they publish. And only 2 states do not publish. This is Russian Federation and Azerbaijan, but we hope that they will review their attitude with time. And it gives grounds to compare Ukraine with other states. This comparison, we try to avoid it. We work with each state individually, and this is a dangerous comparison concerning basic human rights. It can be detrimental even, but we should say that Ukraine, and this is my personal view, Ukraine belongs to the states with low level of legal culture, with absence of basic understanding of human rights and human dignity in the law enforcement bodies, and Ukraine belongs to the states that should go a long way to adhere to those requirements of European communities. So I would like to ask, what are the first steps that should be made by Ukraine to overcome those obstacles committee speaks about? Committee didn't hide it, and in all the reports we spoke about it a lot. This is a complex of measures. Ukraine have rather good legislation. We cannot say that we should adopt some new law that will stop torture or mistreatment of persons in detention facilities. We can't say this. We should adhere to current legislation. But what is needed? I would set these priorities. First, there should be clear signal, not declaration, but a real signal, the information that will be given to everyone from the top level in Ukraine, from top officials, head of state. These should be key ministers and law enforcers that under no circumstances such as war or external aggression, that in no case they would tolerate instances of mistreatment in the hardest form, such as torture. So there should be zero tolerance to torture, and this signal should be provided from top officials down to the grassroots level. So the top officials should state their position here. Secondly, in Ukraine, there should be a mechanism of effective investigation of any information that shows that there could be some tortures or other instances of mistreatment. And for this, there should be a proper body. And on paper, we have it. It's a National Bureau of Investigation, and it doesn't function. And we have aspirations for this body. And if we create it in a proper way, taking into account European experience, then we can hope that it will work. And what happened in the case of our colleague, when they propose by his own expense to undergo medical examination in a month after torture happened, it shows inefficiency of such a system. Nothing can be investigated in such a way, no results. So, second element, that should be. And the third one, very important, this is not the last one, because it is very important. Education of those people who are involved in the operations or in some working in some detention facilities and detention of people, including the situations when people are in some detention facilities such as psychiatric hospitals or migration centers. There should be education provided, so this should be not on paper, because on paper everything is okay with human rights. Our military studied humanitarian law and they know how to behave in military conflicts, and also the Ministry of Internal Affairs always know what to do. But when actions happened in 2014, it happened that no one is ready, that people have medieval approach. Maybe they use some manuals for counterintelligence, or maybe they are from medieval ages, so we don't know where they come from. So we cannot tolerate it in a state that not only say, but really fight in order to take its place in European family, not elsewhere. So Artyom told us his story, and he said that the hardest was to have this psychological mental torture. And our Center on Human Rights and Amnesty International, the topic of this discussion is that not all the tortures remain traces. So what about the documenting of those cases that you cannot provide evidence, for example? So some beatings, but they do not speak about other types of torture. You are speaking about the first steps that should be made by Ukraine, and you say that there should be clear signal from top officials that Ukraine should not tolerate mistreatment. So what is the difference between torture and mistreatment? What is it? What do these notions mean? You know, it's a good question. I won't go in legal details, but there is Article 3 of European Convention on Human Rights Protection, and it says about full ban on torture and mistreatment of people, and also this is full ban. That is the article. There is no second part that if you, for example, said that you somehow you were criticized legally because of this, so there is no excuse for such treatment if we are speaking about legal matters. So the difference of torture between and other forms of abuse, to establish clear difference, it is difficult. Of course, we may refer to the notion what is torture in the convention that was established in 1987 on the 23rd of July. And this definition is not really clear, but we do not have better. We may say about intensity of suffering of a person. So if there is a low intensity, it is some sort of abuse and mistreatment of person. Then when intensity goes up, this can be considered as torture. But the prohibition is relating to any types, and our committee says that there is ill treatment that humiliates human dignity, and the most grave forms are tortures. So Artyom told us about mock executions when they fire above the ear or just threaten. This is a classic example of torture that is considered as torture in legal practice of international organizations. So we should fight any such instances. So the first line is presence. So this is individual. Each person feels in a different way. So, for example, some threatening is difficult to overcome, and we should have zero tolerance to ill treatment. So we have Gennady Tokarev on Skype. This is a lawyer of Kharkiv advocate group. And I would like to ask whether Skype is available now.
Gennady is a lawyer who many times represented interests of Ukrainians in the European Court of Human Rights in the cases initiated under Article 3 on tortures. Can you please tell me when Gennady is online? And now I'm giving the floor to Maxim Butkevich, monitor of the National Preventive Mechanism, head of the board NGO No Borders. Mr. Butkevich was telling that it is necessary to investigate and prevent tortures, and National Preventive Mechanism in Ukraine addresses these cases. It has been in operation since November 2012. Why did you decide, why did you take such a decision to become a monitor? Thank you for giving the floor. I will tell you why. Oh, we have Skype connection. Why I decided to become a monitor. It is not a short story, but one of the reasons was that our NGO, No Borders, it provides help to refugees from other countries in Ukraine who ask for protection in Ukraine. We have cases with refugees from former Soviet countries, also from southern Caucasus, and we face from time to time in our interviews, we face the explanations of tortures causing physical pain to get evidences and other cruel treatment forms. The most awful form is tortures of relatives, mental tortures. They do not leave traces on the body, but it can break mental health of a person. We face this with Uzbekistan refugees, and there are 4 captives in Crimea who are now in detention in the Russian Federation. And the representative of the state, he does not beat the detained person, but the person just is kept in such conditions where he or she feels unwell or feel mental sufferings, and this is very commonplace form when something should be made to such a detained person in order to get the required evidence, but not to leave traces. For those who doesn't know, and National Preventive Mechanism, NPM. This mechanism provides a kind of watch over the penitentiary system institutions, such as such places as custodial settings. What do you see there? We have many custodial settings, custodial institutions. They are more than our citizens think. And many such institutions, they are not subordinated to the Ministry of Interior. Many of them are subordinated to the Ministry of Social Policy and Ministry of Defense. Very cruel rules are maintained in practice in such institutions, and people can't leave such institutions voluntarily without awful consequences for such a person. So when we visited police departments and saw people who were wristbanded to some facilities, this is already an evidence of tortures. Also, we observed the situation in psychiatric institutions, residential institutions, and there we observed that there is a lack of lighting and lack of air in those premises, and those medical staff may just keep those people tied, fixed to the beds in order that they do not interfere with them, so that they, and in the places of administrative detention, water closets, they can be not separated from the places where people sleep. This is violation of human rights. And overcrowded rooms in the custodial settings. This is also violation of the rules of area where people are kept. And this could cause physical and mental sufferings to people. Does it mean that such conditions of maintenance, does it so that, is it so that the managers of such institutions even do not understand that they violate human rights? Whether they understand that this is inadequate, they just say that they are in-house and they are criminals. What for should we ensure human conditions for them? When we are talking about custodial settings, we are not talking only about criminals. Criminals, they are people sentenced by courts, but there are many institutions where people are kept who are not criminals. Nobody is insured from getting into such custodial institutions. The other example is the other case when we addressed refugee cases. You know that people sometimes are left in the transit area of airports. This is also a custodial setting. You can't leave this area until you are allowed to leave. If for some reason you may be detained there in the custodial settings, in premises where you cannot sleep, where you have no hot food, no water, or just water into water closet. This means that you are in custodial settings, and you should be provided with air, with drinking water. And when you are detained in such an area, this does not mean that you are criminal. Nothing can justify cruel or degrading treatment. People who have been sentenced and who are kept in penitentiary institutions, this is already a sentence, but cruel treatment, unlawful substandard conditions of living. This is already torture. This is already inhuman treatment. The sentence doesn't mean that. When I had a meeting with Red Cross representatives, and we talked about inhuman treatment, the inhuman treatment not always is caused by the reason to get some information. This could be a kind of punishment, but nevertheless, this could not be tolerated. Representatives of the state may say that they do not have money to improve conditions up to standards. We can't ensure adequate ventilation system in a TB hospital because we lack money. But this does not justify cruel and inhuman treatment. This is violation of principles of the convention. Sometimes this is not about money. Timely call to a lawyer and just not beating a person, this doesn't cost money. And now we would like to have an interview with Gennady, a lawyer. Gennady Tokarev is a lawyer of Kharkiv Human Rights Group. Gennady, I know you have one case where you face signs of the tortures. Can you tell us about this case? Yes, I can tell you about this case. I don't have a photo. Do you have the table on you? No, unfortunately not. I would like to start with that there is such an opinion that when new criminal procedure code was passed, that the problems with tortures had been decided, resolved, but the problems have not been resolved. The practices remain the same. I conducted analysis of the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights when the convention has been already ratified by Ukraine. About the tortures which which have not left any traces on bodies, such as the use of plastic bags for choking or beating with bottles of water on the head. This can cause impairment of brains or even can cause death of a person. And there were 18 decisions against Ukraine, starting with 2000, year of 2000. This does not mean that these decisions have been stopped. There is a lag in 7 or 8 years. The last decision for 2000 accepted in issued in 2015. It was about the case of 2008. I don't see any radical changes in this sphere. The new police did not abandon the tortures, because this is a technology, a mechanism to detect crimes in practice. Of those 18 cases which I analyzed, almost all of them concerns the law enforcement bodies of Ukraine, because penitentiary institutions, they do not have motivation to cover up their crimes, because they are closed institutions, and the consequences of torture, they can't be seen. The tortures were used not only against males but also against females and children. In 2008, I was working in the case when children were tortured in Kharkiv, and no punishment was applied to the violators according to the sentence of the court, because the case resulted in acquittal. In one of new police departments in Kharkiv, 2 persons were detained. I was a lawyer of one of those 2 persons. There were signs of theft, but very soon the investigators found that there was no theft, but some police top manager, she decided that she was insulted during the dialogue with the detainee, and the traditional set of tortures was applied. It was the application of wristbands with arm twisting, plastic bag for choking, and at the same time the person was beaten until the bones were broken. The person lost consciousness several times, and at that moment they already knew that he was not guilty. This was just training in how to detect, how to investigate crimes. This is professional deformation of policemen, and even more, they conduct such actions without any official goal that could be justified, without any necessity to do that. This is awful. And indeed, about the cases where Ukraine was recognized the violator of human rights convention. There were dozens of cases. I have been engaged in this process, which was started with Arkady Gushin. As concerns the reasons why the situation is like this, as it was already said by other speakers, the legislation is rather adequate now about definition of tortures and identification of tortures, and preventive mechanism is in place, but the law doesn't work in practice, and the experts know that any tortures and cruel treatment start with unlawful detention. As concern unlawful detention, there are no changes for better that happened, and we try to bring this matter to the agenda, and we filed claims about unlawful detentions based on Constitution of Ukraine and Criminal Procedure Code, but no actions followed our claims. This was detention of Bachkovsky and Staevsky last year. The same was with the case of Korban, when he was arrested on the stairs of the court, where he did not commit any crime, which was obvious. So until the state recognizes in practice, until the political will is in place, that the detention of any person, not only political figures but ordinary people, until such arrests which are unlawful are not punished, until detention will become the procedure based on the law, all those events will continue to happen. And this is only some of cases. The entire situation is worse. In previous years, the number of victims of tortures was set as 12,000. Now it is 62,000 persons. This is a giant number, and it could not be an indicator. It seems maybe that 112,000, and now it is 62,000. It looks like improvement of the situation, but this is not so, because the territory of Ukraine became when we read press releases about the European Court of Human Rights, we can find that only some money, some remuneration to the victims are provided by the sentences. But what about punishment of those policemen who conducted those tortures? Well, this is not so easy to detect who of policemen conducted the tortures. There is no statistics of tortures in police. The statistics is saying about 100 or 200 cases when policemen are punished for abuse of power. As concerns the European Court of Human Rights decisions, yes, really, they issue verdicts of providing remunerations to the victims, compensations to the victims. And after that, the state should conduct actions to bring policemen to responsibility. But the Ukrainian institutions do not perform their duties, do not perform those measures which they should do to punish the criminals in police. So that is why the committee, European committee, blames Ukraine on non-performance of the decisions of the European Court. Of course, then the victim is not satisfied because he or she receives only money, but the violators, the criminals who perform the tortures, they are not punished. This could be done through changing the system of law enforcement bodies and replacement of the staff. And of course, the main thing is political will that should be in place. When the political will is in place, then the violators will be punished. I would like to give the floor to Yuri Belausov, head of the board. NGO No Borders. I know you have some comments on this case.
So, what I wanted to say before commenting about the story of Artyom, I think we know that the main reason of torture does not lie in the fact that people do not know the rules, but the reason is only lawyers speak about the problems. Also, international organizations or some journalists who understand the matter, but for the majority of citizens it's not a problem, and our survey shows that 1/3 of citizens, they say that in some cases people can be tortured. And if we ask whether a person can be tortured if he is suspected in terrorism, people would say that tortures can be applied. For example, on the ground of discussion that was in Tatiana Pichunchik materials and the suspension of work of subcommittee of UNO in Ukraine, and people said that if these people are separatists, they can be abused. So this is the main problem. If we as citizens, if we believe that in the 21st century we can torture people here in Ukraine, and the majority think about it, and this problem will exist. If we believe that we are a civilized state, we should have negative attitude to this. We should not tolerate this. Because if we say that it can be possible, if we see that it as a norm, so we give them the opportunity to torture us or our relatives, our children, and there are cases, Mikheyev against Russia, when the law enforcer became disabled because of the torture. He just didn't think that he can be in the same situation. So this is the problem in society. So if we are speaking about citizens, we should work a lot with them. They do not know the international standards, or they can believe that this is normal. But if these are laws enforcers and the prosecutor's office that should investigate these cases, and also I conducted trainings for judges. If, for example, a judge says if a person do not want to speak, he do not understand the situation with tortures, and they make excuses, and as judge says this, so the judge that provides trainings for others. So they say that his claims on torture, they just try to make excuses in these claims. So we have a lot to do in this area. And about the case Mikola told us about investigation. When months passed after the case, and they asked the person to address medical institution to get medical documents, and Ukraine now is the country where there is many abuse instances. So even the fact of torture is enough, and if, for example, the evidence is enough, and in this case, the Article 3 is violated if investigation is not carried out properly by General Prosecutor's Office, but they didn't conduct investigation effectively, no matter what General Prosecutor's Office or General Prosecutor is, because they have conflict of interest. Prosecutor, according to the legislation, he had the investigation of any crime, for example, a killing happened or something like that, and this prosecutor should react on the declaration of the person that he was tortured, and and these prosecutors, they do not react on the claims on torture, and we hope that independent body that reviews the cases, this is the only body that can do this properly. And this is one more problem, because there is no effective investigation on the cases of tortures in Ukraine. So if there is a new body, it exists on paper, it should work in practice. And are there any practices that can be used by State Investigation Bureau and used in order to deal with these cases concerning torture? Thank you for your question. When I worked as an ombudsman, and we were responsible for prevention mechanisms, and we go with the specialists in the places of detention and national prevention mechanism. It should not investigate. We observe, we record, and we send the information to prosecutor's office. They investigate, but they do not investigate. And then we go there and we see that people lose trust to us, because we there were some cases in the some detention facilities for minors. So we apply to General Prosecutor's Office, and also there should be alternative mechanism in the framework of legislation, and there should be a separate department, and now it works, Department of Special Proceedings, and together with the Ombudsman Secretariat, and they carry out investigation. They made it in the framework of proceedings, and they get information from medical institutions. They record physical injuries, and we should show the prosecutor, after we gathered the information, we presented this information to the prosecutor, but they still do not investigate. And we used the mechanism for 3 years, so collection information, and we are independent from investigation bodies. And it doesn't matter, we do not assess the guilt of this person. We are interested only in the instances of torture. And in this case, we hope that we're ready to share this experience, because for me, the worst situation, and it is shows in the, it is shown in the law that the number of staff of prosecutor's office, it will be provided to the bureau, and they prepared some sort of platform. They will take away the responsibilities, and they will these people, they did not investigate these cases, and if they are transferred without vetting, then this bureau will be transformed in such a structure. We will pay as taxpayers for their services, but we will have low results. So we don't have time, and I give the floor to Oksana Pakalchuk, Executive Director, Amnesty International Ukraine. And we know that for this organization, the most important issue is the start of the work of this bureau. And my colleague told about it, why it is important for us to create this bureau. And this is a traditional understanding that all tortures that were applied by law enforcers, they have never been investigated. Only separate cases were brought to European Court on Human Rights, and it was established that people in the world, they know about it, and third and fifth article we are leading here. So as the Amnesty International, we actively supported the creation of Bureau on Investigation, because for us this is hope that the system will change, because beforehand it was difficult to influence General Prosecutor's Office, training, investigation. All these measures were not effective previously. So we tried to correct the situation. The existing system of control of General Prosecutor's Office over torture that were committed by law enforcers, all these measures were not effective. That's why we believe that this State Bureau investigation is hope for change in Ukraine. And I address everyone and welcome everyone to look thoroughly at vetting of staff, because it's very important who will be the head and deputy of this organization, who will be hired, and it will influence the future. And no, any person can get into detention facilities, and no one is immune to torture. And I'm surprised that there is so little attention towards it, that only lawyers and human rights advocates, they cry that all these issues are really important, but there is little attention. And Yuri said that lawyers on human rights, they speak about it, and also those people who suffered from torture also speak about it. And the delay in the work of the committee, and this topic of the stop of the work of the committee, SBU didn't allow them to their premises, and there were expectations that for some time that will be the topic number one. So the problem arise, but the discussion was that people are not ready to have zero tolerance towards torture. So people make excuses. There is war, there are enemies. People try to find excuses for torture. And I would like to ask you to say why it is important to have zero tolerance to torture and have full ban on torture. I can only say that I am an example of the fact that no one is immune of torture, and I never thought that this could happen to me. And it's very difficult for me even now that that happened to me. I think that full ban on torture is absolutely necessary because on the basis of society, there should be human values and human dignity. This is the most important. And I want to rephrase, anyone can be a victim, so there should not be any excuses for this. And 2016, and we see that legal practice shows that it doesn't give results if we are speaking about torture as an excuse. We see that people are forced to do something and they do not investigate properly. People think that it can be done for some useful things, but this is a myth. We should remember that human dignity should be the basis of existence of human society. So the crime remains unpunished and unsolved. So torture is a drop of water that becomes an ocean. If we look at repressive regimes of the 20th century, when state broke hundreds and thousands of people and forced to spend their life in some terrible conditions, not only physical but also mental. This is enforcement that we see in individual case of torture, when state representative force other person by physical threat to say and to force a person to confess. And this is the Svensson in on a small scale, and it contradicts all values and rights. And you remember the values of Maidan and the society we would like to live in. Do you have questions? I don't know, maybe I would tell you this later, but firstly I would like to ask, how do you record the cases of punitive medicine that is still practiced in detention facilities? And what is the statistics on the death and injuries in detention facilities? I was in Lukyanevsky pre-trial detention facility, and the conditions are difficult there, and volunteers are there. And can you provide some statistics on changes in this area? Because there were investigations how people are treated in detention facilities even in times of Yanukovych. So can you provide some statistics? What is the change in this area? I won't give you the statistics of death about the situation. The only improvement when we are speaking about detention facilities, this is the number of people who are detained there. Due to new legislation, the number of people reduced twice in 2 years. About conditions, no serious improvement. The only thing in the Ministry of Justice, they try to reform penitentiary system, and they try to transfer Lukyanevsky's detention facility. If we are speaking about Ukraine, this was one building of Lukyanevsky detention facility that correspond to European standards, and other facilities are much worse, and in other regions Also, the situation is rather difficult, and as to volunteers, there should be decision of the court, and people can appeal, and I won't take this responsibility on me. So as to medical sphere, some medical. So this is one of the major problems in penitentiary system. So doctors that subordinate to the heads of detention facilities. This is the problem. They are the military or law enforcers themselves, and they carry out the functions of penitentiary system specialists. And they do not record the instances of injury, and they are not able in many cases to provide proper medical treatment. So if a person needs medical treatment, he or she is sent to the penitentiary medical institutions that specialize on, for example, some oncology or some other cases. If, for example, in Dnipropetrovsk and needs treatment on oncology, so he will wait when he will be transferred for a year or 1.5 years, but he needs urgent treatment, and then this person will be brought by train, and it will be detained in different detention facilities, and this person will be transported in very difficult condition. So this system should be reformed. And about detention facilities, the conditions are terrible, and the national preventive mechanism, we will have all the photos and everything presented to the public. And at the end, I would like to send, I never understood the heads of the penitentiary facilities who try to close their facilities and do not show to the public. If I was a head of Lukyanevsky detention facility, I would invite everyone. We also invited the cabinet of Supreme Council in order them to understand how our citizens are treated and what conditions they are. And the main idea, what we can do, is to speak about those problems that are in these detention facilities, but also in psychoneurological hospitals and other facilities where old people live. They are in the rooms and terrible smells, and they have little money for food and everything else. So about 1 million of our citizens are held in terrible conditions. So one more question can be asked, if there is no. So we thank our speakers for participating in this press conference. I would like to remind that the organizers were Amnesty International in Ukraine and the Center of Information, Human Rights, and also Nations Foundation. Thank you very much. Our discussion is over.